Okay. And we are live. Welcome everyone to day 2 of Slow Living Summit's first ever virtual conference. I'm gonna wait a few minutes to let some folks come on before we start. Thank you for joining us. Okay, all right, I think we will begin. My name is Alyssa Harris. I am the Executive Director of Strolling of the Heifers, and welcome to day 2 of our virtual conference. Today we have an amazing speaker, Sandra Steingraber. I'm gonna let Jen Brandt, who is our Slow Living Summit coordinator, tell you all about Sandra and what she's gonna talk about today, and then we'll let Sandra take over.
Right. Yeah, I just want to thank you again, Sandra, for joining us and for all the attendees as well. Super exciting, really interesting times we're living in, so a lot to talk about. Sandra is going to be speaking about fracking and sort of how the scientific, medical, and media findings kind of inform that. So very excited to let her just take the lead right now, and that's what we're here for. So I'll go ahead and let you start, Sandra.
Well, thanks very much. And good afternoon, everyone, from my quarantined home to yours. It's just such an honor to be with you. I can't tell you how much I admire what this summit is doing, its themes, and also so many of the organizations and groups that are part of it are I'm just a personal fan of, and especially two of the keynoters you've heard from already, my friend Bill McGibbon, who's collaborated with me in the social justice movement. I helped to lead the anti-fracking wing of that movement. And Bill, of course, as the founder of 350.org, kind of leads on carbon dioxide, but we've certainly joined forces over the years, especially in my capacity as the one of the co-founders of New Yorkers Against Fracking, and a scientist in residence to Americans Against Fracking, and one of the founders also of Concerned Health Professionals New York. And I should say I'm speaking to you from my home in the Finger Lakes, which is a very rich agricultural area. I live in between two of the largest Finger Lakes. There's 11 of them here in upstate New York, and I live between Cayuga and Seneca Lakes on a little rumply strip of land. It's part of a microclimate that is made cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter by the presence of these very deep lakes and all the water they hold. And so we are perfectly suited to grow wine grapes, which is kind of the agricultural goose that lays our golden egg around here. The land is too rolly to plow. And so, I mean, we do have a little bit of a grain agriculture, but around me in my little village here in Trumansburg are farms that are full of grazing animals and livestock, sheep, goats, heirloom cattle, and so on. And those farmers have really, in ways I hope to describe a little bit to you, have helped us get through some of this quarantine with good local and healthy food, for which I'm deeply grateful. I want to give a shout out also to Frankie LePay, who I know you've heard from. Francis was my first boss out of grad school where I studied agroecology at University of Michigan, and then joined the Institute for Food and Development Policy, otherwise known as Food First, of which Frankie was a founder. And in fact, she hired me 31 years ago, maybe even this month, and really introduced me to the power of public speaking and bringing science about agriculture and food to the eaters and to citizens, and with the hope of moving them to action. So I really learned that from her. And I often publicly thank Frankie over the years when we've ended up speaking at the same conferences and rallies, and thanking her for kind of mentoring me in how to give a speech and how oratory works. But I actually want to thank her for a different reason today and use that as my opening statement. So in June 1989, I interviewed at Food First. I was just finishing up my Ph.D. So I was right out of grad school. And I had to, in my interview, issue a disclosure, which was that I had just been found guilty in a criminal trial, but I hadn't yet been sentenced. and my sentencing was coming up in a few weeks, and I could be going to jail for up to a year if I were to receive maximum sentencing. And Frankie Moore-Lepay said, "We'll wait for you." So I want to tell you the backstory of that as my opening today and rewind to the fall of 1988. I was trying to finish up my dissertation. I was working in forest ecology in a wilderness area in northern Minnesota, and I had already finished 4 years of field work and was analyzing my data and should have been already done, actually. But I had a problem, which was the park naturalist at the state park where I was working was cleaning out some old files one day, and he discovered some old memoranda from the 1960s between the state park manager and the State Department of Natural Resources in St. Paul. And so he thought he would share these with me because he didn't need them anymore. He was just going to toss them. And he thought there might be something of a historical interest about my field site that I would appreciate. Well, there was, and what I found in that pile of documents actually changed the direction of my whole life. So rifling through these old memoranda, a file folder caught my eye because it was literally labeled "Top Secret for Your Eyes Only." And in a line, what I discovered was that there had been in the 1960s a secret herbicide spraying program in the forest that took place in the off season by helicopter, intent to clear hardwood shrubs out of the understory of this red pine forest so that the tourists who visited the park and were driving through it would have better vistas and better views. And this wasn't just any herbicide, but a combination of two phenoxy herbicides, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. These two together, when they're mixed like that, is more popularly known as Agent Orange, which not coincidentally was also at the same time they were spraying this in the park. It was being deployed as a weapon of war in Vietnam to defoliate the rainforest there. And as an aside, 2,4-D is still a weed killer we use now, and in agriculture and in people's backyards. The other ingredient of Agent Orange, 2,4,5-T, has been outlawed because that's the half of it that's contaminated with dioxin, which was causing birth defects and cancer, although 2,4-D as well has links, especially to lymphoma. So I just, as an aside, want to mention that the original purpose of the phenoxy herbicides was not to make farming better, as I learned as a young biologist, but rather it was originally kind of invented as a chemical weapon of war with the intent of destroying the Japanese rice crop during World War II. And of course, we dropped the atom bomb instead. And then we had all these stockpiles of Agent Orange left over. And then we began to market it as a pesticide for farmers. And then, of course, it found new purpose in warfare during the Vietnam War. So in 1970, then, there were hearings in the US Congress about the cancer and birth defects caused by this herbicide as part of this military operation called Operation Ranch Hand in Vietnam. And that was then halted with the discovery of all the harm that was being done. And Agent Orange also stopped being used in my study site very abruptly at the same time that these hearings happened. But because I was specifically researching species composition between hardwood shrubs and pine trees, the discovery that one of my two study organisms had been poisoned in this location I was collecting data in 20 years earlier, it completely messed up a big part of my study. And it delayed by a year my ability to finish my dissertation committee. So my committee then allowed me to write a new chapter to make up for the wrecked data on chemical weapons that were developed by scientists and as part of classified research projects and then turned into tools of warfare. So that's what I was working on in my last year of grad school. I was also out of money at this point because the extra year that was required meant that I had run out of my fellowship, and so I had to find a job. And so I did take a job at our student newspaper, the Michigan Daily, which had offered me a paid position to write editorials. Okay, so from here, the story kind of takes a surreal turn as kind of art meets life, or maybe science meets life. So while working as a commentator at this newspaper, a group of journalists and I began reporting out information that we were getting from an anonymous source about classified weapons research that's being conducted right now in our campus. And the incoming president of the university, who was soon to be inaugurated, was involved in it. So I became part of a group of 4 of us who were reporting out information about this. And then my job kind of was to write the editorial positions, the commentary on it. And of course, as you can imagine, students were really upset, and that led to a lot of campus unrest and objection that this person who had been involved in this research should become our new president. So the day of his inauguration in October 1988, there was a student protest and many hundreds of students turned out. And the 4 of us reporters who worked at the paper were on hand, and we had our press passes, and we were actually there to write a story about the inauguration. And then there was a police riot. The first person grabbed by the police at the student protest outside of the building where the president of the university was to be inaugurated was one of the 4 reporters who had worked on this set of stories with us. And he was trying to show the police his press pass at the time to gain entry into the building. The police took him down to the pavement and began rubbing his face back and forth into the concrete. And yes, he was black. He was a reporter, and he was black, and he was the only one of us reporters who was black. And they chose him to throw him down onto the pavement and then lift him up bleeding and toss him into the back of an unmarked car. I remember locking eyes with Raleigh. I remember the blood on the inside of the back windows. I remember screaming. I remember standing with many other students in front of that unmarked car. And that's the last thing I remember until I woke up in the back of an ambulance. I feel like the news imagery of the last 2 weeks can help you kind of picture this scene right now. After I got out of the hospital, I learned there was a warrant out for my arrest. I was being charged with assault and battery against a police officer, and also another charge of disturbing the peace. Raleigh was also charged, and as well as 2 others who were also the reporters who worked on the story. So there were hundreds of people out protesting that day. No one was arrested and facing charges of those many hundreds, except the 4 of us reporters who had been working on a story about the university's president's involvement in weapons research, one of which was me. It was also happened to be unexpectedly writing a dissertation about chemical weapons research, although I didn't set out to do that. I was just trying to write about forest ecology. So I finished my dissertation and successfully defended it. And a few days after that, I unsuccessfully defended myself in the Washtenaw County Courthouse for the charge of disturbing the peace, but happily was acquitted of the assault and battery charge. And that's when I flew off to San Francisco after my trial, but before my sentencing date, for my job interview with Food First, who was actually very interested in everything I now knew about herbicides. And I had to say, I'm going to jail, but I don't know for how long. It could be 6 months or a year if I get a maximum sentence. And Francis Moore LePay said, "You're hired, and we will wait for you." So thank you, Frankie, for that. Then I went back to Michigan, back to the courtroom where I was sentenced for 12 days. Those 12 days of incarceration were an object lesson in white privilege. I feel sure, based on the other sentences I heard meted out that day to people who had unrelated charges, that there was a reason I was only given 12 days rather than the maximum sentence. I was one of the only white women in my cell block, and I was largely spared from the cruel and arbitrary rules that brought punishment and suffering down on the heads of the other women I got to know there. So I learned to use that privilege in the service of my community and openly shared food with pregnant inmates in violations of the rules that forbid the sharing of food. And I did so openly under the eye of the correction officers, and they never messed with me. So all this is to say that Black Lives Matter, and that we cannot solve any problem. Military research on campus, toxic pesticides in our food, systems of farming, as long as our brothers and sisters are being murdered in the streets. I've gone on to be arrested many more times as a civil disobedient in the service of climate justice, and including with Bill McGibbon at my side. And I've received longer sentences than 12 days. But I remain 31 years later, more traumatized by the helplessness of watching my Black friend and co-author being ground into the pavement while standing right next to him than anything else that has ever happened to me while I've been in handcuffs. Ending this trauma and the racism that fuels it is a precondition for solving any of the hugely important problems that we're gathered at the summit to talk about. So that's my opening statement. Obviously, the media images of the day have kind of brought all this forward in my mind, right? So I want to turn now to looking at food and farming from a climate justice perspective. And there are many ways of talking about climate justice, so let me kind of provide you the way that I look at it. It's both a framework for understanding, and it's also a global social movement. Climate justice concerns itself with the ethical and political dimensions of climate change rather than its purely physical elements. And attending to the inequalities that arise from climate destabilization, climate justice points to actions and solutions that the climate crisis, that address the fact that those least responsible for the problem are those suffering the greatest harms in confronting the highest barriers to participate in the political process. Those include Indigenous people, poor people, people of color, women, farm workers, farmers, rural inhabitants, and also islanders, refugees, immigrants, and youth. So bringing a human rights focus to the climate crisis, the human justice frame is expansive, powerful, and profoundly intersectional. And I want to try to use it now to look at farming, but I'm going to start off in this kind of really big panoramic view and then move down like a funnel into our farming systems. So I'm talking to you right now in my quarantined house, and you're listening to me in your quarantined house. And surrounding our homes, between you and me, is a pandemic disease that at this writing kills nearly 1,000 Americans every day, and has become, in fewer than 6 months since the first report of its arrival here, the leading cause of death in the United States. While the novel coronavirus was not directly caused by the climate crisis, climate change did set in motion conditions that were conducive to the spread of this animal-borne pathogen, disrupting entire ecosystems. Climate change has forced wildlife to migrate, encounter new species, and serve as a potential new host for pathogenic agents such as SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes coronavirus disease. Loss of habitat from deforestation and extractive agriculture create further opportunities for formerly isolated animal species to collide with each other and with human populations, and so pass along infectious agents. So here's just the first connection I want to make, is that climate change, working in partnership with big extractive agriculture, has disrupted wildlife habitats in such a way that have set animals moving and colliding with other species and colliding with human species in ways that would not have happened without the climate crisis or with extractive agriculture. And the result has been the coronavirus pandemic that threatens all of us. However, its risks and harms are not all shared equally. And here's the other kind of power of climate justice to help us understand this. Here in the United States, African Americans, Latinx, and Native Americans are all at disproportionately higher risk of death from the coronavirus-related infection. And the reasons are multiple. These populations are more likely to suffer from underlying health problems and access to health care. They're also more likely to breathe dirtier air. There's a growing body of evidence showing that exposure to air pollution dramatically raises the risk of both catching coronavirus and dying from it. Harvard University study of more than 3,000 US counties found that small increases in fossil fuel derived air pollution are linked to dramatic increases in coronavirus death rates, even after controlling for other relevant factors. And there are other studies from China and from Europe that show how air pollution actually enhances not only your chance of dying from coronavirus, but also can enhance the contagion of it and increase your chances of getting it in the first place. So in other words, a dependency on fossil fuels has triggered a climate crisis that has set the table for an animal-borne disease to jump to human hosts and also harmed human health directly by increasing chronic exposures to air pollution in ways that make coronavirus transmission more likely and the disease more lethal. A climate justice analysis helps us understand why fossil fuel extraction operations and corollary petrochemical industries causes of both the climate crisis and lung damaging air pollution both, right? They're disproportionately located in non-white and impoverished communities. St. James Parish, Louisiana, with some of the worst air quality in the United States from oil refineries and petrochemical plants, is a majority Black parish that now suffers from some of the highest coronavirus death rates in the nation and also some of the highest cancer rates in the nation. And I want to point out that that petrochemical complex that's located in that strip we call Cancer Alley from Baton Rouge down to New Orleans and around to Galveston, Texas. That petrochemical industry has a role in the manufacture of farm chemicals, right? So here are kind of all the complicated connections coming forward. So let's take that's the big view. Now let's kind of take a closer look at food and farming and the complicated relationship that it has with the climate crisis. And what I'm going to argue here is we not only bring a justice perspective to thinking about this, but also complexity theory and systems theory, because the relationship between the climate crisis and the farming crisis is actually really complicated. I want to say straight up that it can't be dealt with by simply telling people not to eat animals or simply promoting veganism as one part of the solution, which may be the most controversial thing I say today, I suppose. But let me unpack this for you scientifically. So I think that arguing that we simply should remove animals from the agricultural equation is not based on good science if we're talking about the climate crisis. And it's also not good from a justice perspective because it makes it very hard to do movement building, and it creates a wedge between urban and rural partners that we need to be working together. So let me back up now and do a little basic science with you on the climate crisis. And I know we have some really sophisticated people in the audience who may know this in more sophisticated ways than even I do. But let me share with you the language that I use in talking about to audiences about the climate crisis, just so you can see how I talk about it. And if you're certainly free in the work that you do to take any of this, if it's useful to you, and incorporate it into your own narrative. So this is how I talk about it. It kind of comes down to this. We live on a planet that circles the sun and it revolves on its axis as it goes. And so as it revolves every night, our part of the world turns away from the sun and it becomes completely dark, because one of the things that we get from the sun, of course, is light energy. And at night, the light energy entirely disappears, it's gone, and we're not going to see it again until the next morning, minus the little bit that's reflected back to us off the mirror that is the moon. We also get another form of energy from the sun, which is heat energy. And importantly, that form of energy does not entirely disappear at night when we're faced away from the sun, because if it did, our blood would turn to ice every night and the temperatures would plunge to many hundreds of degrees below zero. Our oceans would become ice rinks and life itself would not actually be able to go on. the reason that light energy entirely goes away, but heat energy doesn't, is attributable to the fact that our atmosphere contains a certain number of gases that have the ability to trap the heat from the sun, which is trying to bounce off the surface of the earth and escape back into outer space, but is prevented from doing so by fact of these molecules that are in the atmosphere that can trap heat, the so-called heat trapping gases, the greenhouse gases, right? And interestingly enough, the way they do this is that these molecules, and there's basically two of them, carbon dioxide and the other is methane. So there's carbon comes in two forms, and these are the two dominant greenhouse gases. And when they are struck by thermal radiation, which is heat, their molecules are oriented in such a way that they will start to vibrate, and vibrating things trap heat. So all these dancing, vibrating molecules all night long, it serves as a blanket to us, for us, and all other forms of life, so that we don't freeze to death every night. Where does it come from? And I should say that oxygen, which is not a heat trapping gas, is obviously something we desperately need. We breathe in a pint of atmosphere with every breath, and the oxygen, which makes up 20% of that pint, is snatched by our red blood cells and taken to all the cells of our body, where it moves into, telling you 7th grade biology now, it moves into the mitochondria of our cells, remember those guys, and goes through the Krebs cycle. And metabolism happens, and that's how we extract energy from the calories of energy from our food. And then we exhale the carbon dioxide. So the oxygen, which is out there in the atmosphere also, is not a heat trapping gas. So it's not helping us stay alive at night. That's not what we need oxygen for. But the CO2 really is. CO2 is also a waste product for us. It's the byproduct of the Krebs cycle. And so it builds up in our blood, we exhale it through our lungs, and we breathe out a pint of atmosphere, and with it comes out the carbon dioxide from us just being alive. And so essentially all living things on Earth, their exhaled breath has altered the chemistry of the atmosphere in such a way that it makes conditions for further life possible. So here's something to think about. Carbon dioxide actually lasts 100 years in the atmosphere. So you're breathing right now. Your exhaled breath is going to outlast you. You're going to be dead in the ground, and your breathing is still out there in the atmosphere. And every night it's vibrating to keep heat here on Earth, to allow other living things to keep living. So that's your legacy to the atmosphere, is all of your exhaled breathing has put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to help the creatures who come after you stay alive, in the same way that we are benefiting from everyone who came before us. Now, I said there were two greenhouse gases. The other is carbon dioxide. One is carbon dioxide, the other is methane. And methane represents dead stuff, decomposing dead stuff. And it's an actually more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. It's not as abundant in the atmosphere, but it's 87 times more powerful molecule for molecule at trapping heat. So one molecule of methane, which is a carbon with 4 hydrogens around it, will trap 87 times more heat over a 20-year period than carbon dioxide. However, methane doesn't last as long as carbon dioxide. It only lasts a decade or two, so it's going to fall apart. It doesn't last for 100 years. So it's shorter lived, but more powerful as a greenhouse gas. So the unholy trinity then of fossil fuels, right, is coal, oil, and natural gas. And our situation is such that we're no longer in a balance where the living and the dead are contributing methane and carbon dioxide in a stable way, and by breathing and by decomposing. And the plants are taking in the CO2 that we exhale, and they are giving us oxygen. It used to all be in a balance, but then about 150 years ago or so, we figured out as human beings how to blow up these ancient cemeteries below our feet, which contain the fossilized and petrified remains of animals and plants that lived 400 million years ago, that are trapped down there in the geological strata. And we're exhuming their corpses and bringing them up to the sunlit surface of the Earth where we live, and shoveling them into the crematoria we call power plants and internal combustion engines and home furnaces, and lighting them on fire. And in so doing, we are loading up the atmosphere with CO2, but also in the process of extracting those things, oil, coal, and natural gas, all kinds of vaporous methane comes out of the ground in the course of drilling and mining. And so that's also going up into the air. And so now we have increased the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere somewhere between 30 and 40%. And we pretty much tripled the amount of methane. So the blanket that we use every night to stay warm is getting thicker and thicker. It's too thick, it's too hot. And then all the consequences of climate change, the droughts, the hurricanes, the melting ice caps, the rising sea levels, follow from that fact. So what I want to be clear about now is that there's a lot of talk about the role of animal agriculture in contributing methane into the atmosphere. So I just want to put this in perspective. Fossil fuels contribute 89% of carbon dioxide emissions, 89% from fossil fuels. And methane, and there's still some unknowing in the science, but the best evidence we have available to us right now, because there's a huge surge in methane that's actually worse than what's happening with the trends in carbon dioxide, that is also coming from fossil fuels. And we know this because there's thermogenic methane and there's biogenic methane. And even though they're the same molecules in terms of having the same atoms in them, through kind of chemical fingerprinting and isotopic analysis, we can distinguish between the methane that had been trapped for 400 million years in the bedrock and has now found its way into the atmosphere, and the methane that's coming out of livestock as living organisms who are grazing and burping methane into the atmosphere. And so there are competing studies, but the weight of the evidence shows that the livestock are playing a much lesser role than we thought, and natural gas and oil extraction, in particular fracking, is what's really driving this. And the most recent studies show that about 1/3 of the current increase of methane in the atmosphere is coming not just from any kind of oil and gas extraction, but through this one particular method of extraction that we call fracking, which involves, blowing the bedrock up to get the bubbles of oil and gas trapped inside the rock. In other words, we're no longer searching for oil and gas that exists in giant pools and reservoirs under the ground. We pretty much burned through all that. Now, increasingly, we're going after tiny bubbles of oil and gas trapped like bugs in amber inside the bedrock, and we're using freshwater resources as the club to smash the bedrock apart and try to get those bubbles and oil up to the surface. And it's through that technique that the United States has now, in the last few years, become the world's #1 producer of oil and gas. So if we keep our eyes on the prize, because we only have a decade or so to turn this problem around and really rapidly decarbonize, what we need to do is go after energy, not go after agriculture. Okay, that being said, it is the case that agriculture rides a tandem bicycle with fossil fuels. The methane that we blast out of the ground in the form of natural gas, which is what methane is used to make things. It's not just, we don't just cook our food with it. It's not just used in power plants to make electricity. It's not just used in our home furnaces. But in addition, it's the starting point to make a lot of things, including anhydrous ammonia. So all the anhydrous that's out there, which is synthetic fertilizer that is entirely what our corn agriculture depends on. That methane comes from natural gas extraction. We could not do vast grain monocultural agriculture without anhydrous ammonia. We can't make anhydrous ammonia without fossil fuels. It's all natural gas. And in addition, ethane, which is blasted out of the ground along with methane. So let me back up for a second. So oil and gas are both trapped in the bedrock, and we can extract both of them by fracking. It's just that crude oil is liquid, and natural gas is a vapor. And within what we call crude oil or petroleum, there are lots of different, it's a chemical mixture, right? Everything from the really heavy goopy stuff like asphalt, all the way up to the much lighter weight stuff like kerosene. So that's kind of all in the mix when we're blasting oil out of the rock. When we're blasting natural gas out of the rock, there are also many other vapors down there, not just methane. There's butane, which is cigarette lighter fluid. There's propane, which we also use as a fuel. And then there's also another lightweight hydrocarbon called ethane, which we do not use as a fuel. It's not a good fuel. And so it also comes up when we, with the methane, which we put in a pipeline and send on its way. But ethane is really kind of a waste product for the natural gas industry. However, it's a great starting point to make petrochemicals from. And so a lot of farm chemicals have as their starting point ethane. Methane, remember, is used to make anhydrous ammonia, but ethane can be used to make a lot of other things. So this is a sort of another, I'm going to stop here and remind us all that Rachel Carson was right about all this, because she pointed out that farm chemicals like pesticides were never really invented to solve a problem to control pests in fields. In other words, farmers didn't come to the scientists of America after World War II and say, you know what, we're having this increasing problem with weeds and insects in our fields. Can you come up with some chemical to help us kill them? That's not how it happened. In fact, these chemicals like Agent Orange, but also DDT and lindane and all these other older chemicals were originally invented to serve wartime purposes. And specifically during the war, we had lost access to natural materials because there were, German U-boats blocking harbors and our trade routes were disrupted. And so we needed, for example, a natural, we needed to substitute nylon for silk, right? Because we lost our Japanese silk supply. So we needed something to make parachutes out of for our paratroopers. And so we invented nylon, which came out of a barrel of oil. Similarly, petrochemicals began to replace naturally occurring fertilizers. So after the war was over then, we were desperate to make sure that the country didn't fall back into a depression, and all of these chemicals that had served heroic purposes in the war without any advanced testing for safety were then marketed to farmers to control weeds and pests. And as Carson pointed out, they just didn't work very well for that purpose. They were never designed for it. They killed a lot of other things. They were leaky. We were laying a whole kind of barrage of poisons down on the whole agricultural system. And nobody would kind of have designed this way. It's just that we had this surplus of chemicals left over. And in some cases, we had all these planes left over too, right? All these pilots came home from the war. Planes could be retrofitted for crop dusters. And so that it was really wartime thinking that came up with these solutions. So it's kind of a wag the dog situation. And it continues to be that. That's what I want to point out, that there's value added for the fossil fuel industry to make this stuff. If they couldn't sell off stuff like ethane to the petrochemical industry, then just selling the methane as natural gas isn't very profitable. So it is the case that transforming agriculture away from cheap meat, away from stockyards, that obviates the need for chemically dependent grain monocultural agriculture is a climate problem, but it's not necessarily because eating animals per se those animals are contributing methane into the atmosphere. They are, but that's not the lion's share of the problem. Instead, I want to argue it's because meat-based diets prop up a demand for petrochemicals, which makes the extraction of fossil fuels more profitable and keeps the whole project going. And I want to point out that, you know, just to make sure I'm not demonizing farmers here, that this is not just an ag industry issue. Petrochemical production is going on for all kinds of other industries too. I mean, just yesterday I was giving a talk for a lot of healthcare providers and patients over this issue of ethane being used as a building block to make a chemical, another chemical called ethylene oxide, which is used as a sterilant in the healthcare industry to sterilize surgical equipment. It too didn't get invented because doctors came to scientists to say, you know what, we need something better than steam to sterilize our surgical equipment. It came about because ethylene oxide was used during World War I to make mustard gas. And after that war was over, they tried to figure out some commercial purpose for it. And it ended up being used to sterilize spices. And from there, after World War II, they thought, well, what if it works to sterilize surgical equipment too, right? So in other words, this product also helps prop up the fossil fuel industry. And if healthcare providers and medical engineers could redesign that system, sterilization system, away from, you know, do things different, make things out of different materials, rethink the whole system, and obviate the need for ethylene oxide, then we could take value away from the fossil fuel industry, which is the driver of the climate crisis, right? So farming does play a role in driving up, in adding value to fossil fuels in a way that we want to deconstruct. But I think telling people that they have to become vegans is not exactly it. Again, these are complex systems, and it really requires systems thinking to see how this works. So from my point of view as an agroecologist, what we need to do is look at farming in the way it can either prop up or undermine fossil fuel bottom lines, because it's fossil fuels that are the lion's share of the problem. All right, now I'm going to move on to something slightly different, and just to point out that farming may help fossil fuels with their bottom line, but fossil fuels are destroying agriculture. It's doing so indirectly, of course, through climate chaos, changing weather patterns, destroying pollination systems. And I know that you're hearing about those at this summit from all kinds of other speakers. So I'm just going to mention those, knowing that you're really going to get into the details of those in other workshops. But I want to talk about the direct impacts of fossil fuel extraction on farming, and that is by looking at this through a land use point of view. So fossil fuel extraction is in the process of industrializing and contaminating US farm country. And I write about this in my capacity as one of the founders of Concerned Health Professionals New York. We are the authors of this big monograph called The Compendium of Scientific, Medical, and Media Findings Demonstrating the Risks and Harms of Fracking. And I've provided our organizers with the link to this. It's available to you as a free download if you find this information useful, because there is a whole chapter in here on the threats that fracking poses to agriculture and soils. So let me just summarize for you our findings in this. So drilling and fracking operations have moved across the landscape of North America. That's how it's allowed us to become the #1 producer of oil and gas in the world, right? And as it's kind of turned our farm country into an industrial staging ground for extraction, it's kind of just left ruin in its wake. So in California, for example, fracking wastewater has been injected illegally into aquifers, which are used for crucial irrigation supplies. So now we have contaminated aquifers, and the water that's used to irrigate crops is also then contaminated. And that makes it really hard for farmers, especially in times of severe drought, which we're entering into because of climate change. So you couldn't have chosen a worse time to kind of wreck a bunch of underground aquifers. So fracking wastewater itself is being promoted because it's a big waste product for the industry and they want to get rid of it. So they're trying to market it as water for livestock and also for irrigation. And this is really happening in the San Joaquin Valley in a big way. And we've tested, I say we, my colleagues in the who do this work have tested the wastewater. And they contain at least 10 known or suspected chemical carcinogens, as well as over a dozen chemicals that have no known toxicological data. We don't know if they're harmful or not. And what we also don't have good handle on is knowing how our crops can take these fracking chemicals up that are being used in the irrigation water. Can they translocate them through their roots? Can it end up in the, the sap of the fruit and in the food itself? We don't know the answers to that yet. But these findings certainly do raise questions about the direct exposure of affected soils as well as food crops through bioabsorption through plant roots and impacts on livestock due to ingestion. There are studies and case reports from across the country that have in addition highlighted instances of death, neurological disorders, aborted pregnancies, and stillbirth in farm animals that have come in contact with fracking wastewater. Just this week, there's a very interesting study from Pennsylvania showing that horses living on a farm in Pennsylvania surrounded by fracking wells have problems with a certain kind of birth defect in foals. And interestingly, there's a farm across the border in New York State where fracking is banned. That farm feeds its horses the same sources their feed from the same place, and those horses don't have a problem with that birth defect. Additionally, farmers have expressed their concerns that nearby fracking operations can hurt the perception of agricultural quality and invalidate value-added organic certification. I've traveled around the world looking at the impacts of fracking on rural communities. I know that in Romania, farmers could not sell their food after a fracking well went into the community. The market no longer, they canceled contracts with them. And I saw a similar thing happen in Argentina. Land use changes and the transport of invasive species by drilling and fracking operations is something that we've documented. So in other words, when fracking comes in and clears land and creates a lot of soil compaction to build these well pads, a lot of weed species get transported into, and suddenly you have all these invasive species that you didn't have a problem with before. And in forested areas of Pennsylvania, drilling and fracking operations have greatly reduced canopy covers and diminished the carbon storage capacity of photosynthesizing forest trees. And of course, then that represents habitat loss for things like birds and bats and other organisms that help us control pests by providing what we call ecosystem services. So soil compaction in addition in cleared areas is detrimental to the growth of crop plants and also encourages the growth of invasive species and contributes to soil erosion and things like that. So I'm interested in talking with farmers about these issues, about the ways in which fossil fuel extraction operations, which often come into a rural community, promising riches to farmers, promising them that they can retire, send their kids to college if only they give permission for oil and gas companies to blow up the bedrock beneath the farm. And that is kind of promoted as, this is your bank vault. There's money down there in the bedrock, and we'll get the gas and oil out and give you royalties and so forth. And our job, I think, is to let farmers know that you can destroy your farm, you can destroy your water, you can compact your soil, you'll get more weed species. Here's the data we have, but also to let farmers know that that there are better ways to add revenue to farms, for example, by hosting solar panels or wind turbines than putting a drill rig in your back 40. So because I work at that interface, I have found that it's not helpful when you talk to dairy farmers about environmentalists who they believe are only going to drink oat milk and eat tofu and are not going to enjoy their cheese, right? So just raising that as an issue, that in our attempt to kind of build a movement and build bridges, I'm looking to talk to farmers, and having come from a farm family in Illinois myself, I have a little bit of street cred, I think, and convince them that, look, all of us eaters and you farmers, we have this common enemy. It's the fossil fuel industry, and let's just stay focused on that. It's really time to evict this industry. And farmers, along with African Americans, along with youth, along with indigenous people, along with women, are disproportionately impacted by climate change and by the harm of fossil fuel extraction. So we had some luck with this project in the years that we were fighting the fracking industry here in New York State, which I hope you know ended in a resounding victory for us. We have a statewide ban on fracking. It took us many years to get there, to convince our governor on the grounds of public health to prohibit rather than permit this industry from entering New York. And it was very powerful when we organized with farmers. So I'm going to close now by telling you a story of a happy protest that did not end up with handcuffs. And then I'll let Rachel Carson actually have the very last word. Farmers Against Fracking was a very powerful group of people. And here in where I live, we have a bakery called Wide Awake Bakery that is made exclusively of heirloom wheat grown on organic fields and using recipes that allow this particular kind of wheat to make very good bread, because we live in a place where we can't grow hard wheat, we have to grow soft wheat. And so we have in my village, we have not only the farmers who grow the wheat, we also have a mill that employs people, and we have a bakery that employs people, and we're very proud of our local bread, Wide Awake Bakery. While we were fighting fracking, we learned that these farmers wanted to expand their operations, but all the land around them was leased to the gas industry and represented an existential threat to this whole operation. And so they then came with us to Albany to talk about that problem and to encourage the governor to move forward with by throwing his lot in with the farmers growing the wheat rather than with the frackers. And we tried to draw that line very starkly. So for this particular campaign and this action, our rallying cry was break bread, not shale. And the farmers and the bakers and the millers all came together, and the bakery baked hundreds of loaves of this delicious bread, which we bore above our heads and carried them up to the governor's office and made a big pile of bread loaves with our sign that said, Farmers Against Fracking. And I really do believe that that spectacle of walking through our state house to the governor's office, bearing loaves of heirloom bread above our heads, was a turning point in our campaign. And it was a moment of common purpose of urban New Yorkers and rural New Yorkers coming together. And that's what I'm really interested in exploring and doing. So last then is Rachel Carson, right, who started all of our feet kind of walking this path. I am very honored to have been asked to be the editor of this new collection of new edition of Silent Spring, which also includes a lot of her writings that are letters to other scientists, as well as her speeches that she delivered after Silent Spring came out, and she was really under attack by the chemical industry and the pesticide industry. so you can kind of see her mind at work as she wrote this book. Before she wrote the chapters, you can see kind of some of her rough drafts and see how she was playing with her ideas and writing letters to her colleagues. And then you can see the kind of invective of fury from the pesticide industries after, and how they went after her, when we call it trolling now, I guess, and how she pushed back against that. So I spent a lot of time reading her private materials as we put this collection together. So a couple things here. One is that we include love letters between Carson and her beloved Dorothy Freeman. So in this month of Pride, I just want to say that one secret Carson had to keep while she was piecing together Silent Spring was the fact that she was in love with a woman named Dorothy. And they wrote these beautiful letters to each other. And Dorothy was Carson's reader because she was not a biologist, she wasn't a farmer. But Rachel often shared with her her early ideas and early language. And if Dorothy liked it, that was kind of her, first reader. And it's very tender, and some of them are very steamy, and I'm very glad they're in the book. The other secret that Carson was keeping while she was piecing this book together, Silent Spring, was the fact that she was dying of breast cancer while writing it. She did not want her enemies in industry to know who she was in love with. She didn't want her enemies in industry to know that she had metastatic breast cancer. But you can see, especially in some of the correspondence between her and her research assistants, that in the end of her life, the tumor spread to her neck and her vertebrae. It made her writing hand go numb, so she had to dictate some of the things. She had to lie down and only work a couple hours a day. She had eye infections. She couldn't see and read for a while, and people had to read things out loud to her. She suffered really, really greatly, and she was hugely relieved that she was able to even finish the book before she went on. And in the back of the book, here's this photograph of her, where she's delivering the last months of her life. She's delivering testimony to Congress about her findings. And she's got this really unfortunate wig on that's kind of crooked on her head. And she's had radiation treatment, so her neck is all puffy. Of course, that wasn't discussed on the day, but I'm really glad that that's the photograph in the back, because you can really see the suffering that she went through. So here's one of the very last things she said in one of the very last speeches she gave. Hope I have it marked on the right page here. She said, this is in a speech to the Audubon Society. And so the effort must and shall go on. Though the task will never be ended, we must engage with it with a patience that refuses to be turned aside, and with a determination to overcome obstacles, and with pride that it is our privilege to contribute so greatly. Thank you, guys.
Jen, you're muted.
I unmuted myself and then muted myself. So to say that was very powerful. I just also want to especially thank you for sharing your story. That was very personal, and I'm sure not very easy to share. As an Indigenous person, I especially personally appreciate that you are staying up and saying something with the platform that you have. It is very much appreciated, especially for myself, who's in Brooklyn and marching and going to vigils every night as well. It's been a crazy time, but appreciate it.
You're in the epicenter of it.
Sure are. So thank you very much. So yeah, we want to open this up for questions right now. We have about a half an hour, so we're gonna go kick it off. And I'll ask the first one. Okay, we have from Jessica Sennett, and they say, have you spoken with the dairy farmers of Wisconsin? I work for the cheese industry, and we are going to organize a panel soon about a sustainable food supply chain very soon. Would love to see if we can help bridge the divide some way.
Invite me to speak to the Wisconsin dairy farmers. I would absolutely love that. It's been a while since I worked in Wisconsin. My most immediate connection there is to give a hand, and some of them are dairy farmers, but to give a hand with the frac sand mining operations near Eau Claire in western Wisconsin. So very quickly, there is no shale in Wisconsin or in the upper Midwest. The bedrock there is sandstone, which so thankfully there's no fracking going on, but unthankfully, silica sand is used as actually a really important ingredient in fracking fluid. So it's, yes, it's the water, our precious drinking water that's used as the club to break the shale up underground under very high pressure. But if you just used water, fracking wouldn't work, because what's called the lithostatic pressure of the earth would press down on all the shards of bedrock you just created and close the cracks back up again and re-trap the oil or gas, right? So what you do is you shoot silica sand grains down there to prop the cracks open forevermore so that the oil and gas can flow out. So the silica sand grains, which are resistant to crushing, kind of serve as little door stops to hold these fissures open. And you have to mine it somewhere. And the epicenter for mining frac sand is in Wisconsin. And unfortunately, the dairy farm crisis, with all kinds of ridiculous pricing problems, have made dairy farmers desperate enough to kind of give up the farm and cash in and open land to frac sand mining. Frac sand mining is even more devastating as a land use practice than fracking itself, I would say, in terms of what it does to agriculture. Because it basically is open pit mining, and the number one export of Wisconsin right now is itself. It's the sand, right? So they're blowing up their sandstone bedrock and all the coulees and hillsides, and shattering it and into great piles of sand, and then exporting it so it can be shot into the bedrock, you know, in Pennsylvania and in North Dakota and so on. And so I have worked with the people on those front lines who are trying to prevent dairy farms from being sold out to the frac sand mining industry. There's a lot more going on in Wisconsin that I'm really interested in, so I would love to do some work there.
Gotta unmute myself again. So we have Linda Martin, who just has a comment. Says, no question. I just want to say how grateful I am for your explanation and information presented in a way that in these parts now makes sense to me. This was so very helpful. I have a follow-up question to that, however. So I'm just kind of curious about how your thinking has developed, evolved, and changed over the years, and maybe some of the factors that have contributed to that.
Well, I think like a lot of us, I began with the idea that a lot of us had, especially those of us who were working with Food First in the 1980s, that a diet for a small planet meant that we should move away from animals and just focus on plant-based diet. And there's a lot of truth to that, right? But I hope I explained why there are things that are left out of that. So I think I'm now really interested in understanding how our agricultural systems can be made resilient, can be made more diverse, because diversity is the bedrock of resiliency. And if we are going to have regenerative agriculture, and again, I didn't talk a lot about that today because I know there's so many other amazing workshops that people are going to hear from on that topic, that really we need to have animals in the equation, right? And we need just to be really honest about that. So I've kind of certainly evolved in my thinking around that. I'm aware here in my county that another, let me back up a minute. One of our other local industries that we're proud of is something called Ithaca tofu. We grow tofu beans and we manufacture tofu, and it's local and we all eat it and kids love it and it's part of our economy. And one of the farmers who's one of my neighbors, who was the very first certified organic farmer in New York State, he's not a young guy anymore, is what we call Tony the King of Beans. So he grows a lot of beans for the tofu, right? He sources his fertilizer with biodynamic dairy farmers. So the manure from livestock operations is what he uses rather than fossil fuels. And I have to somehow laugh when people I know who are very, like, veganism is very important to them, which is fine, but they may not know that actually if it weren't for the manure of animals, we wouldn't be able to get off the pesticide treadmill and get away from fossil fuel generated anhydrous ammonia so that we can have organic food. I'm also aware that as our own weather patterns become more and more erratic, like we just had a really cold spring. I'm looking out, there's a window behind me, but also in front of me where I have walnut trees. Just 2 days ago, our walnut trees leafed out in my backyard. That is, I mean, it's already June and we're just getting leaves out, right? So there's not much coming in right now. There's some greens that are coming in from my CSA farm and from my farmer's market, but not a lot else. And so animal products really help provide food security for us when there's a huge hailstorm and nothing else is, is working out. So I'm increasingly grateful to various different kinds of farmers. And I'm really interested at this point in my life in figuring out how we can all work together and how we can find, common purpose in kicking out the fossil fuel industry. Look, oil, gas, and coal is what's driving the climate crisis. They just have to go. And farmers can have a heroic role to play in helping us do that. And I think that's going to require animals and plants together in the equation. That's how I see it right now.
All right, so we have a couple more comments as well. We have Sandra, thank you, from Anne Bransfield. Sandra, thank you so much for your work and your raw honesty. We are all in your debt. Another lovely comment. And then Jessica Sennett, something that you had spoke earlier before everyone had jumped on the call. Jessica Sennett says, thanks, I will reach out if your contact can be left here somewhere. So we're gonna put that back in the chat again so that if you folks wanna reach out to Sandra after to talk about anything, you can get a hold of her.
Let me jump in here a minute, Jennifer, and just say that I do have an angel funder who, Ceres Trust, who is really devoted to the idea of sustainable ag, Ceres as in cereal, right? And they help bring me, and then of course in the old usual before times, I would like physically bring me from into their community to talk about science in the public interest, whatever it is. Like yesterday I was talking about sterilants used in medical equipment to a group of doctors and patients, and today I'm talking to farmers and people in the food industry. And so so I had this great opportunity to for groups that aren't otherwise funded for programming to come to your community either remotely like this or hopefully someday in person, and help do a public lecture for you. And sometimes that can be combined with a fundraiser that you might want to have for your organization, or I can speak to the media, do a lot of interviews. And one, I think oddly, maybe not so odd, is the idea that sometimes I can go in and make the same arguments you're making, but as somebody who's an outsider, I can get on your local NPR station or on your local news in a way that if you were just trying to do it by yourself, you couldn't do it. But I'm very committed to sharing platforms, right? And to uplifting the voices of people who are on the ground, so that when I leave town, the people in the audience know that you guys are the geniuses and the to-go-to experts on this topic, and that people should join with you to make whatever change it is you're trying to do. So I'm just so delighted to have that opportunity, because my heart is in the front lines. My heart is with the grassroots groups. That's where we're going to make change. It's not going to be me as a scientist taking the same data and giving testimony on, to our elected officials. I still believe in that and I still do it, but all by itself, that doesn't work so well. I guess I should say, having said that, I'm actually doing a briefing on the Hill next week for a piece of legislation that hopefully will ban fracking. I'm doing it remotely. So I'm actually in the middle of preparing to do a briefing to congressional staffers. So it's not like I don't believe in speaking truth to power to our government, but I just want to make the case that what I enjoy most in this world is coming to rural communities and having some fellowship with you and doing some kind of public event, even if we have to do it remotely.
You got to hit it from all sides, right?
Yeah.
Also, we'd be happy to share that out with our attendees as well, if you want to share that information with us, Sandra. Great. I'm going to let Lisa take over right now, so I can.
Sure. So we have a few more questions from Tatiana Schreiber. I appreciate your point about the difficulty talking to dairy farmers about their practices if one eschews milk and drinks oat or almond milk instead. Do you know if there are any good studies that have done a life cycle analysis to look at the environmental impact of oat milk or almond milk, including packaging, etc.? That might be helpful.
Wow, that is a really good question, and I do not have any answer at all for you. I'm so sorry, I don't know. My sense is that there's so many people who are making these decisions based on what they believe is their own health reasons. So I'm not sure that that information would be really determinative, but yeah, somebody should do that analysis. And my sense is that there's oat milk and then there's oat milk, right? There's some of it that's really loaded up with different fillers and some of it that's more simple, but I don't know anybody who's actually doing that. Hopefully it's out there somewhere. I'm sorry, I can't be more help.
Our next question is, what are the ongoing efforts in other states to prevent or stop fracking? Is this a national movement?
It sure is, and thanks for that question. Here's one I can answer. So Vermont was the very first state to ban fracking, so thank you, Vermont. And that kind of was wind under our wings in our own campaign here in New York, and we banned fracking in 2014. And then we kind of took the show on the road. We organized Americans Against Fracking. And my little shop, which is kind of the scientists in residence to the anti-fracking movement called Concerned Health Professionals New York, we helped organize health professionals in Maryland to have health professionals, concerned health professionals in Maryland. And they also banned fracking. So Maryland has banned fracking, and then Oregon and Washington states have banned fracking. And then there are many counties in California where there are fracking bans and restrictions. And then there are many moratoria and bans around the world. I'm proud to say that this compendium of data on the risks and harms of fracking was submitted for as part of decision making and hearings and public intervening processes in Scotland and Ireland, which have banned fracking, and parts of Argentina. We translated it into Spanish, and I traveled with it to Mexico and Argentina a couple of years ago. And there's a big fight going on right now in South Africa. So my sense is that the world is turning its back on fracking, but it's kind of a zombie industry that doesn't, just when you think it can't possibly keep going on, it goes on. So right now we're in a period of really contradictory trends. So we just got some good news yesterday. We found out that a compressor station, which is what is needed to push the gas through the pipelines and is really highly toxic. They're usually placed in rural agricultural areas because they are so toxic, they're so loud, they're usually placed away from urban areas, and so they're placed in farm country, which is not good either. But there is one planned for an environmental justice immigrant community called Weymouth, Massachusetts, to push gas from the fracking fields of Pennsylvania all the way up to Canada, where it will probably be exported. And so there will be 3,000 kids who are living in the blast zone of this compressor station, and it will make their air far more toxic than it already is, which is already bad because it's an environmental justice community, meaning it's already as a minority community on the receiving end of so much toxic stuff. And the good news is they just found out yesterday that the state is denying the air permit for that. That doesn't stop the construction altogether, but it gives the community a chance to buys it some time to get a foothold, right? To find other ways to try to kill this thing off. We had some good news in New York that the Williams pipeline has been stopped by our governor, and that took a huge movement. And thank you to the people in Brooklyn, New York, Jennifer, for leading the charge on that. At the same time, the Trump administration has announced again yesterday that it is no longer requiring environmental reviews for things like pipelines, which make it really harder to stop them. So, and we've opened up all kinds of public lands in the West for more fracking, even though oil and gas prices have tanked. And the oil and gas industry is, the dust hasn't yet settled, but it seems to be on the receiving end of a lot of the stimulus money, which is too bad, because this is a great moment in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of a climate crisis, to just nationalize this industry and shut it down and replace it with something else. We could, I mean, they're on the ropes, we could do that. That's kind of not what's happening. So there's kind of some trends coming out of Washington in the wrong direction, other trends coming from the grassroots and from frontline communities that are going in the right direction. So, you know, it's a battle. It's the great work of our lifetime to try to end the fossil fuel party. It's just really time for this party to end. The curfew should be for the oil and gas industry. So that will be, you know, the work for the rest of my life. And I'm really interested in building big coalitions, and farmers have to be part of it, which is why I'm delighted that farming plays such a big role in the Green New Deal and in our imagining for a green recovery. And I'm always trying to get more farmers at the table. This can't just be urban people kind of coming up with solutions without involving the people at the front end of things. And I think there's a space for that now. I mean, now that we've seen that we're all connected here, that we can't solve the pandemic without helping the meat packers, right? That food connects all of us, from the fields to the stockyards, to the slaughterhouses, to the grocery stores, and all the people that work in all those chains, that we're all really our fates are interwoven here. So I feel like this is a moment where we can really think about how to redesign agriculture and really have farmers as the co-authors of that redesign, not just, hey, here's how we're going to do things.
Thank you, Sandra. I just want to go back to Anne Bransfield. She had a comment before, but she still has her hand up. So Anne, I'm going to unmute you, and if you have a question, please ask it. All right. Okay, so I guess her comment was all she wanted to say. We'll move on. Holly Shimizu has a comment. I saw you win an award from the Heinz Foundation and was so happy to know of your work. You said you were going to use your award funds towards anti-fracking, and now to see your success in New York to ban fracking. Congratulations, you are a role model.
Well, thanks for that. I guess I just want to say that having a fighting spirit is something I've really learned about. So I was, in 2011, I became the recipient of the Heinz Award for my earlier research on environmental health. And that came with a $100,000 check, you know, right? Which is more money than I've ever seen ever. And it just kind of dropped out of the sky. And I was just beginning what I thought was going to be my next book project. I was researching a book on fracking. In fact, when I got the phone call from Teresa Heinz Carey, I was out in Utah interviewing people who were dealing with fracking. And I remember that was the summer that Tim DeChristopher, who was a civil disobedient, who had tried to stop fracking in southern Utah, was being himself sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. And I was asked by the people supporting him if I would leave this southern Utah area where I was doing the research to come to the courthouse to kind of hold a space and give a speech while we waited to find out what Tim's sentence was. And having been somebody who knows what it's like to wait for a criminal sentence, I said yes. So I went, and that's the day that Tim looked at the judge and said, I'm not asking you for mercy, I'm asking you to join the climate justice movement. and this is what love looks like. And then he was, given 2 years in prison, wrapped in chains and taken out the back door. And what I saw spontaneously happen was people in grief filling the streets and just spontaneously doing acts of civil disobedience, lying down and blocking traffic during rush hour. And this was my introduction to civil disobedience. I had already gone to jail once, right? But I hadn't intended to. The only time I ever got beat up in my life was by a police officer, and I woke up, I was unconscious, woke up in the hospital and found out I had a warrant out for my arrest. So it wasn't exactly civil disobedience. But so I got to see civil disobedience, and I got to think hard about what I was doing with planning on writing this book. And then it was just a couple days later, I got that phone call telling me that I was going to get this big check. And I just had Tim's words in my head, right? That this is what love looks like. And I kind of knew right then and there, I wanted to spend the money not on studying fracking, not buying myself time to write another book, because I had written 5 books already. And as much as I think books are important, this felt like an emergency. So especially since there was land at the end of my own block, that way, right there, that was going to be leased to the gas industry. So I decided to try to use the money as seed money to form a coalition to actually stop fracking without knowing how in the world I was going to do that. Because I'm just kind of a shy biologist that likes to look at data. And this is my writing room where I put all the words together. And I don't mind being in quarantine. I'm kind of introspective. I could be here a long time and then go for some hikes. So I didn't know what I was doing. But we just started, there were only 4 or 5 of us who all chipped in a little bit, whatever we had to form our first coalition. And then we just kept building it out. So that by the time, 3 some years plus years later, we banned fracking, our coalition had gone from 4 or 5 of us, plus me, the crazy biologist with the check, to 500 groups, including Farmers Against Fracking, Faith Leaders Against Fracking, which represented 500 churches and synagogues, Elected Officials Against Fracking, which represented another 500, mayors and city council people. We had Business Leaders Against Fracking, 1,000 different business leaders, including some of our breweries and wineries and yogurt manufacturers. We're very proud of, Chobani yogurt and so on. And so we got politically powerful. And so I kind of learned once we developed some momentum, I didn't have to go do that organizing. There are people who know how to do that better than I. And I could kind of retreat and then work on compiling all the science so we could take science to people in frontline communities, to farmers, to our legislators and so on. But we also got artists, and artists often have star power, like Yoko Ono and Mark Ruffalo. So when they came to our press conferences, the press actually covered us. So I think we built a movement that had such political power that the governor couldn't ignore us anymore. And the way I see it now is the social movement opened space for the science to speak. The governor realized that he was going to lose his base if he allowed fracking to move forward. And then we came along and provided him a scientific rationale for all the reasons that he shouldn't allow this. That being said, I'll just be honest and tell you, there are some farmers who are still angry with me, who feel that they were used by this campaign, that we came along and said, don't blow up your bedrock. Don't allow the farmers to come, the frackers to come and ruin your farm, join with us. And then after it was over, they felt like, hey, what happened to you guys? And that's a true thing. At that point, instead of going back and helping them set up solar panels that they could get, fee and tariffs and all these different kind of value added things to help direct capital development to farm country, instead of doing that, I ended up helping with an anti-fracking movement in Maryland. I ended up going to Argentina to give a hand with that campaign. So there wasn't just capacity to kind of do all the follow-up. I think it's still going to happen because there's a whole group of people that are really working on building out renewable energy and coming up with a grid that can support it, but that's just taking a lot of time. So there's a gap, a time lag between when we ban fracking and when we can roll out the alternative. And in that gap are desperate dairy farmers who are dealing with every possible economic crisis in the dairy industry, and they're putting bullets in their head. And I'm the person that urged them not to let the frackers in, right? So I just want to be really transparent and honest about that, that it's not all a story of you know, David beats Goliath.
Thank you for that. I appreciate, you know, the honesty around that as well. I think we have time for probably one more question here. Fred Taylor asks, or says, your earlier work in relation to atrazine living downstream has been a great inspiration to me. Can you give an update on the progress against the use of atrazine and other herbicides? And are there any connections between those herbicides and the climate justice issues?
Well, there certainly is connections. I'll work my way back. Yeah, herbicides are a real threat to farmers. So we see higher rates of cancer in farm families, including in children and including in farmers. And increasingly, the evidence suggests that herbicides are playing a large role in that. We thought we were making some progress under the last administration. All of that, of course, ended in 2016. So we have all kinds of evidence for harm and all kinds of really good ideas for how things could be changed, but pretty much everything's on ice until we get a new administration. That being said, I saw some good news go by early this morning or yesterday, and now I want to say it's about dicamba. I think that out in California, they were able to actually stop something. I'm sorry, that's all I'm going to be able to say about it. I have to catch up on the news a little bit. So the sort of the environmental justice piece of it is that most herbicides work by poisoning from within, poisoning the weed from within, either by halting the miracle of photosynthesis or causing the plant to kind of blow up from oxidative stress and so forth. And so weed killers are often very water soluble because they actually have to be taken up through the roots and go into the plant and kill the plant that way. And because of that, they tend not to stay on the fields that they're sprayed. So they will run into gullies and creeks. They fall like a falling curtain of chemicals and get into groundwater. They evaporate and get into raindrops and fall with snow, and you can find them in fog and so on. And so because they drift so easily, if you try to grow things like grapes, which are very sensitive to herbicides, then, you know, farmers that are trying not to use them can be collateral damage. So, you know, any time that somebody's profiting and somebody else is harmed, you have a justice issue. But honestly, in order to deal with toxic chemical reform of all kinds, whether it's farm chemicals or any other, you know, ethylene oxide, this sterilant that causes cancer, that created a cancer cluster around a plant that is sterilizing medical equipment. This is the community I talked to last night. Like, these problems can't really be meaningfully solved until we have a government that works. There's lots of things we can do at the state level. And I think that's why banning fracking state by state has been pretty powerful for us. The thing about the oil and gas industry is that it requires this massive infrastructure, right? So if you don't allow it to spread its tentacles all over the landscape, it can't really work, which is why it's so great that in Weymouth, Massachusetts, the denial of one air pollution permit is going to, as long as they don't have that permit, they can't operate that compressor station. As long as that compressor station can't compress the gas won't move. If the gas doesn't move, then all the frackers who are blowing the gas out of the ground in Pennsylvania have no place to put it. And whoever wants to sell it as liquefied natural gas and head it across the ocean up in Canada can't do that either. So that means there are many Achilles heels to this big, long, huge process and infrastructure, heavy dependent industry, the oil and gas industry. So there are many, many points of intervention. And sometimes those, you can work at the state level or work in the courts and try to deny a permit that way. But no matter how clever you get with the law, always, 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 you need public pressure, because the law only works in a context where courts, jurors, local electeds can feel that there's outrage among the community, and people are not going to stand for this. And there may be consequences for people's political careers if they don't pay attention and listen to the science. So you can't just leave it to the lawyers to figure out the loophole by which you can close these things down. You let them do their work, but in the meantime, there needs to be a show of the depth and breadth of opposition to more fossil fuel build out. And I think farmers are really powerful messengers for that. That's what I'm really interested in. I would love to be able to replicate in some way on a larger scale what we were able to do with our bread march and Farmers Against Fracking. I think that there are some groups of people, nurses are another, right, that are just make for really good messengers. So I'm really interested in thinking about how farmers can be organized and mobilized and how their voices can be really uplifted here.
Well, I will say thank you again. We are out of time for this session. However, we do have a happy hour in half an hour. That's hard to say. And in our program, we have a cocktail that one of our lovely staff member, Erica's husband, invented. It's called the new green old fashioned. Correct me if I'm wrong, Lissa.
That's right. Yep.
And I'll have Lissa say our parting words. We'll see you in half an hour. If you want to join us for happy hour.
Yeah, Sandra, thank you again for your honesty and just your amazing breadth of knowledge of all this incredible information. We really appreciate you being here with us. Thank you to our sponsors, Breakthrough Beverage and Meadows Bee Farm. And I hope that you can all join us for our happy hour. Woo! Thank you all.
See you soon, hopefully. Thank you.
See you soon. Bye.